Welcome to Eternal Diary. I was going through the script recently and kept stopping at the same moment. Not the day they handed her the empty title, not even the morning 3 days later when everything came apart. The moment that changed everything was when Celeste said yes, without hesitation. By the end, you'll understand why that was the most dangerous thing she could have said. The boardroom at Hargrove Capital smelled like burnt coffee and recirculated air. Not the kind of coffee you'd order on purpose. The kind that had been sitting in a silver carafe since the 9 o'clock partners meeting and hadn't been touched since. I remember noticing it and thinking, these men charge clients 7 figures in annual fees, and no one can be bothered to make a fresh pot afternoon. I noticed things like that. It was, in fact, why I was good at my job. There were 4 of them across the table. Graham, the managing partner, who had the specific quality of seeming both exhausted and pleased with himself simultaneously. 2 of the institutional directors, whose names I had learned to pronounce correctly in my first week, and whose opinions I had learned to anticipate within my first month. And Adrian. My husband sat at the far end of the table, just inside my peripheral vision, in the chair that was technically neutral, but positioned slightly closer to their side. I had noticed that before I even sat down. It told me everything about how this meeting was going to go before anyone opened their mouth. Graham cleared his throat. He always did that before delivering something he had already decided. "Celeste," he said, "the firm has been doing some thinking about structure." I folded my hands in my lap, not to calm myself, just to have something to do with them that wasn't visible. "We feel," he continued, and I noted the royal we. The we that meant a decision had been made in rooms I had not been invited to. That the head of client strategy role would benefit from some fresh energy. Fresh energy, that was what they were calling it. And I looked at Graham, then at the 2 directors who were both studying the table, then at Adrian who was looking at his phone. He was looking at his phone during the meeting where they were restructuring his wife out of her role. The role she had built from nothing. The role that had generated 30% of the firm's revenue in the last fiscal year. I looked back at Graham. "Who do you have in mind?" I asked. He said Valentina's name carefully, like it was something that might spill. I nodded once, and then I said yes. The thing about Valentina was that she was not, in the traditional sense, incompetent. She dressed well. She spoke in meetings with the kind of practiced confidence that reads as authority if you are not paying close attention. She had been at Hargrove for 14 months, a line which was long enough to learn the vocabulary, but not long enough to understand what the words actually meant. She also happened to be sleeping with my husband. I had known that for 4 months, possibly 5. The specific timeline matters less than what I had done with the information once I had it, which is to say, very little that was visible, and quite a lot that was not. The first sign was not a hotel receipt or a suspicious text. It was the way Adrian started saying her name at dinner. The way a person mentions a name when they are trying to make it ordinary. He said, "Valentina thinks," the way you say something 3 times to teach yourself to stop noticing it. I noticed it on the first mention. By the time he said it a 3rd time, something about her perspective on emerging market exposure. Me, which was frankly a subject neither of them was equipped to discuss. I had already started making certain arrangements, but I will come back to those. I had been at Hargrove for 11 years. When I joined, the client strategy function did not exist. There was a loosely organized group of relationship managers who reported to whichever senior partner had the best golf handicap that quarter, which meant there was no real consistency, no tracking system, and a client retention rate that the firm had quietly decided not to calculate because the number would have been embarrassing. I built the function from 6 people to 22. I designed the client segmentation model that is still, as far as I know, the basis of how the firm prioritizes its book. And I established the quarterly review protocol that increased our net promoter score by 41 points in 3 years. I personally managed the 14 largest accounts, which between them represented roughly $1.5 billion in assets under management. I know how that sounds. I am not telling you to impress you. I am telling you so you understand what they were actually doing when they decided to hand my position to someone who had been in the industry for 14 months. They were not restructuring. They were confident that the machinery I had built was so solid it could run without me. That was their mistake. It was also the mistake I had been quietly counting on them to make for the better part of a year. Because there is a particular thing that happens when you build something exceptional inside an institution. The institution begins to confuse the infrastructure with the person who runs it. The machine becomes background. The machine hums, produces results, does not break down, never creates a crisis. And so gradually, it stops being seen as a human achievement and starts being seen as a feature of the building itself. Like the plumbing, like the electrical systems, nobody says thank you to the plumbing. At Hargrove, I had spent 11 years being the plumbing. I had been thorough, I had been consistent, I had been indispensable in the way that produces not gratitude, but invisibility. And when someone finally looked at the plumbing and decided it could run itself, I said yes, and did not correct the assumption. And to tell the full story of what happened, I need to go back 18 months. Not to a single event, to a change in atmospheric pressure that I registered the way you register the drop before a storm, not as one thing, but as the cumulative weight of small shifts. The first shift, Adrian stopped asking me about my work. This sounds minor. In the early years of our marriage, he had been genuinely interested, or had performed interest with sufficient skill that I could not detect the difference, which amounts to the same thing in practice. We had talked through client problems together, traded professional opinions, maintained the fiction, at least, of intellectual partnership. Around 18 months ago, the questions stopped. Not abruptly. The way a tide goes out. You don't see it happening until you notice how much ground is exposed. I steered the second shift. I stopped being included in certain meetings, strategy discussions about firm positioning, conversations about the institutional client pipeline, things that I had always been in the room for, not because of seniority alone, but because my function was directly relevant. I began to receive the minutes rather than the invitation. This happened twice before I started tracking it. After that, I tracked everything. The third shift, Graham had begun, in the preceding 6 months, responding to my account updates with slightly more brevity than usual. One paragraph where he used to write 3. Acknowledgement without engagement. It was the specific quality of an email from someone who has already made a decision and is managing the relationship until the moment they announce it. By the time they sat me down in that boardroom, so I had been watching the signs for long enough to have built a response in advance. 3 months before the boardroom meeting, I had sat down with a spreadsheet and mapped every piece of institutional knowledge I held that existed in my head and nowhere else. The list was long, more specific than I had consciously realized. The first category was what I privately called the relationship context layer. For each of the 14 major accounts, I had built, over years, a dense map of every person who mattered to the relationship. Not just the primary contact, the backup contacts, the board-level connections, the specific individuals at each client organization who had influence without formal authority, the communications preferences of each of them, who responded to email, who only responded to calls, who needed 48 hours notice before anything substantive was discussed, who would end a relationship if they felt they were being transferred without a personal introduction. None of this lived in the firm's client relationship management system. I had never put it there, not out of deliberate concealment at the time, simply because the CRM was a blunt, standardized tool designed by people who had never managed a complex institutional relationship, and my notes were specific. And I kept them in systems I had built for myself. A private notes application, a master spreadsheet on my personal laptop, and the part of my memory that I had spent a decade training to hold this kind of operational detail. Valentina would inherit the CRM. It would show her account names, AUM figures, and a contact name and phone number for each account. What it would not show her was that most of those contacts had not used that number in 2 years. They called my personal cell, and they called it because they had come to trust the person who answered it, not the institution behind her. The second category was the regulatory calendar. Hargrove managed institutional funds for 7 pension schemes, 3 university endowments, and 2 family offices with complex structures. Each had specific reporting obligations, regulatory disclosure windows, and in 2 cases, bespoke contractual requirements that had been negotiated individually and existed nowhere in the standard client contract templates. I maintained a master calendar for all of this on the shared drive. It was accessible to anyone in the department. but it was organized in a way that only made coherent sense if you understood the underlying logic, and understanding the logic required knowing the full history of how each obligation had been established and updated. There was one account in particular, the Caldwell University Endowment. Its quarterly regulatory disclosure required a specific sequence of steps involving two internal teams, a specific external legal contact at Blackthorne Partners, and a filing window that had shifted twice in 3 years due to regulatory changes. The updated process had been redesigned 8 months ago, following a resolution passed by Caldwell's investment committee that required the internal sign-off sequence to mirror their own committee structure. I had implemented this redesign, and I had briefed the relevant people in partial terms, enough to execute their individual piece, not enough to understand the whole sequence. No one had asked for the whole picture because no one had ever needed to hold it. I had held it. The next filing window opened in 11 days from the boardroom meeting. The third category was what I called informal client migration. 3 months earlier, when the signals had become unmistakable, not just the dinner conversations, not just the meeting exclusions, but the specific moment when I discovered that 2 junior staff I had personally hired seemed to be taking instruction from someone other than me on a project that fell directly under my function. I had begun quietly having conversations. Not formal conversations, not explicit exit conversations. The kind of low-stakes, personal check-in calls I made regularly anyway, because that was how I managed these relationships in the first place. I asked after children and board changes and the specific pressures each client was navigating that quarter. And at the end of each call, I said something like, "I've been doing some thinking about what the next chapter of my career looks like. Nothing imminent, nothing decided, but if I ever made a move, I'd want to make sure there was full continuity for you." Every one of them said a version of the same thing. Wherever you go, we follow. Not all 14, 11. But those 11 represented $1 billion and $200 million in assets under management. I had not told Hargrove this. Josephine called me the evening after the boardroom meeting. She had been my closest colleague and clearest-eyed friend in the industry for 9 years. We had overlapped briefly at Fenwick, the boutique advisory house where I had spent 3 years before Hargrove, and had stayed in each other's orbits through every career development since. She was now a partner at Meridian, a mid-size asset management firm that had been quietly expanding its institutional business for 4 years, with considerably more discipline than their competitors. I picked up on the second ring. I was sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine I was not drinking, watching the city beyond the window go through its early evening routines. "Tell me," she said. No preamble. She never bothered. "They gave my role to Valentina," I said. A pause. Oh, not surprised. Josephine had been tracking this situation with me for months. She had helped me think through every implication. "When does the transition start?" she asked. 6 weeks, I said. "And the Meridian conversation?" "I think it's time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what I've always found most interesting about you, Celeste?" I waited. "You never fight for rooms you're already leaving," she said. I looked at my wine glass. "No," I said. "I don't." The Meridian conversation had been running quietly for 6 weeks before the boardroom meeting. Josephine had raised it first in the way that important professional conversations often begin, as a hypothetical over coffee after a conference panel on institutional client retention, which had a specific irony neither of us commented on. "So if you were ever to consider a move," she had said, "what would you need?" I had told her precisely what I would need: structural autonomy, a meaningful equity stake in the business I built out, and the ability to bring the relationships I had personally cultivated, which was a professional way of saying I was not arriving without clients. Meridian came back with a number. It was a genuinely good number, better than my current Hargrove compensation package, including the deferred equity that I had already begun, separately and quietly, thinking about. I had asked Josephine's firm's legal team to review my Hargrove employment contract 6 weeks earlier, framed as a general question about industry-standard non-solicitation terms. Their assessment was specific. The non-solicitation clause had been drafted from an outdated 2019 template. ICE prohibited me from directly approaching current Hargrove clients during a 12-month post-departure period. It did not prohibit clients from approaching me. It did not prohibit clients from terminating their relationship with Hargrove independently. And a point of case law that had developed in the intervening years had made the primary provision's enforceability questionable in the specific circumstances the clause described. I kept that assessment in a folder on my personal laptop, which no one at Hargrove had ever accessed. By the time I walked into the boardroom and they told me about the restructuring, I had a signed letter of intent with Meridian dated 4 days earlier. All I had to do was say yes to handing over my role. Navigate 6 weeks of a transition I would manage entirely on my own terms. And leave. In the weeks that followed the boardroom meeting, Adrian and I lived in the apartment as though nothing had materially changed. He came home at the same times. We had dinner twice the first week at the kitchen counter, not the table, which had started to feel too ceremonial to sustain the performance we were both maintaining, and talked about nothing in particular, in the way that two people who have stopped discussing real things fill the air with inconsequential ones. He did not apologize. He did not name what had happened, not directly. On the third evening, while I was slicing bread, he said, "You handled that well, the transition announcement." I kept cutting the bread. "I just want what's best for the firm," I said. "I know," he said. He believed me. That was the thing about Adrian. Oh, for all his intelligence, and he was genuinely intelligent, which made what had happened both more comprehensible and more specific, he had a fundamental inability to conceive of me as someone who would not ultimately defer to him. 11 years of marriage had not updated that model. Even watching me build something extraordinary, year after year, had failed to update it. He had a version of me fixed in his mind from the early years of our relationship, and he had chosen to live inside that version rather than revise it. It was, ultimately, what made everything that followed possible. I had also, 3 months before the boardroom meeting, quietly begun the process of separating my finances. We had never shared all our accounts, a choice from the early years that had felt, at the time, made like a reasonable expression of individual identity and had turned out, in retrospect, to be an act of unconscious self-protection. We had 2 joint accounts, one for household expenses, one associated with a property investment we had made together in the 4th year of our marriage. The property I had already consulted a solicitor about. The investment had been made in both names, but my capital contribution had been substantially larger. Documented, carefully and consistently, in the transaction records and correspondence that my solicitor had already reviewed. A formal partition, if I chose to initiate one, had a predictable outcome given the documented contributions. The paperwork was prepared. I had not filed it yet. The household account I had managed differently. Over the preceding 3 months, I had gradually redirected my direct deposit to a personal account, reducing my exposure to the joint account without triggering any observable change. The adjustments were incremental enough not to be conspicuous. My personal account now contained 3 months of independent living expenses, unconnected to anything Adrian had access to. None of this was performative. It was the same instinct I applied professionally. When a structure is beginning to show signs of instability, you do not wait for visible damage before you move your most valuable assets to safer ground. You read the structure early while everything still looks intact, while no one is watching your hands. You move quietly, and you move first. The handover began formally in the first week of what I thought of as the transition month. Valentina came to my office on a Tuesday morning. She knocked, which I found interesting. It was technically already her role, and she did not need to knock. But she knocked, which told me something about her self-awareness in this situation. She understood, on some level, that she was still on territory that had not fully transferred. She was wearing a silk blouse in a particular shade of ivory. I noticed it because I had once owned something almost identical, bought during a client conference in Milan, and had stopped wearing it after Adrian had complimented it at a dinner 2 years ago. I had not made that connection at the time. I was making it now. "I just want to do this properly," she said. She sat across from me. "I know this is a complicated situation." "It's fine," I said. She looked like she had prepared for a longer answer. "And so I want to make sure I have access to everything I need," she said. "Of course," I said. "I'll walk you through the shared drives this week and make sure you're set up on all the relevant systems." "And the client contacts?" she asked. "Everything's in the CRM," I said. "I'll walk you through the segmentation model and how I've structured the account tiers." She seemed reassured by this. She left 20 minutes later, and I sat quietly for a moment before opening my laptop and sending Josephine a one-line message. 6 weeks. What I did during those 6 weeks was this. I conducted the handover exactly as described. I prepared the shared drive documentation. I walked Valentina through the segmentation model, the firm's client tiering structure, the account review cycle, and the administrative contacts across the business. And I introduced her to the relevant people in compliance, legal, and fund operations. I was professional, thorough, and, on the surface, generously cooperative. I also did 5 things that were not documented anywhere. The first, I completed a full review of every piece of client information I had ever stored on personal devices or personal systems. My contact notes, years of accumulated context about each client's communication preferences, the names of their families, the specific sensitivities in every relationship, the operational details that made each account run, went into my personal laptop and nowhere else. Hargrove's CRM had account names, AUM figures, and primary contact numbers. What it did not have was any of the context that made those numbers meaningful. The context was mine. It had always been mine. Nobody had ever thought to ask for it in a formal sense, because it had never occurred to anyone that it existed as a separate thing. The second, I stopped routing client correspondence through my Hargrove email and began migrating ongoing dialogue to a personal address I had registered months earlier. Not for all clients, only the 11 who had indicated they would follow me. This was done gradually, conversation by conversation, over the course of weeks, in a way that felt to each client like a natural shift, rather than a deliberate one. By the time the transition was complete, the most substantive client conversations were happening on a channel that Hargrove had no visibility into. The third, I called the external legal contact at Blackthorn Partners, who handled the Caldwell University endowment disclosure. I explained that there was an upcoming transition in relationship management, and that for continuity on the quarterly filing, the one opening in 11 days, all coordination should come directly to me, and I would handle the internal routing. He agreed without hesitation. He had worked with me for 4 years. He trusted my process management, and there was no reason from his perspective to question the arrangement. The fourth, I confirmed the status of my employment contract and the specific non-solicitation analysis the legal team had prepared. I knew what I could do, what I could not do, and, crucially, what clients could do independently, which was considerably more than the clause intended to restrict. The fifth was the detail that took the most thought and the least visible effort. On my last week at Hargrove, as though I did not produce a genuine handover document, I produced a document that looked exactly like one. It had the correct section headings, the appropriate level of detail, the right number of pages. It was organized in a way that created a convincing impression of completeness. But the sections that looked most thorough were the sections that left the actual operational logic unwritten. The process steps were named without being explained. The contacts were listed without context. Anyone reading it would feel adequately briefed. Anyone trying to use it to navigate a real situation would find at the critical moment that the instructions for the most important steps were not there. Not missing, just never present. My last full day at Hargrove, I arrived at 7:15. The building was quiet. The cleaning crew was finishing on the lower floors, and 2 junior analysts whom I suspected had a complicated relationship with sleep were already at their desks. The office smelled different in the early morning, less like recycled air and more like the industrial carpet cleaner used overnight, something faintly chemical and specific, the smell of institutional spaces trying to present themselves as looked after. I walked through my office. It was already mostly cleared. I had been taking personal items home gradually over the preceding 2 weeks, a small thing each day, so that the clearing out happened without ever looking like packing. On the final day, there was almost nothing left to carry. A succulent that had sat on my windowsill for 6 years. I wrapped it in a piece of paper from the printer. A framed photograph from the credenza. 3 people at a client event 4 years ago, laughing at something I could no longer remember. My personal laptop. The laptop had been mine since the beginning. I had purchased it at my own expense when I joined, a preference for speed over the firm's standard-issue hardware that had seemed like a personal quirk at the time. It contained, among other things, every piece of contact context I had built over 11 years, every client note, every relationship map, the Meridian letter of intent, and the solicitor's file on the property partition. It left with me in my shoulder bag, between the wrapped succulent and my jacket. I sat at my desk for a few minutes before anyone else arrived. The city below was shifting into its early morning configuration. That specific pale quality of light that appears between 6 and 8 when a city has been running all night and hasn't quite stopped. I thought about the first client I had ever brought in independently. A family office run by a former engineer who was famous for being unreachable, not rudely, just selectively, in the precise way of someone who has learned that time is finite and most conversations are not worth having. I had written him a one-page letter before calling, explaining exactly what I was going to say when we spoke, so that when he picked up, he would have already decided the call was worth taking. He had been a client for 9 years. I felt the weight of all of it, briefly. The way you feel a cold floor in the first seconds of morning. Present, specific, this and then gone as the body adjusts. I put the succulent under my arm and walked to the door. I said goodbye to no one except the security guard at the front desk, Patrick, who had been there longer than I had, and who handed back my access card with a nod that contained something like recognition. "Good luck, Ms." He caught himself. "Ms. Celeste." I smiled at him. "Thank you, Patrick," I said. I went through the revolving door. The cold hit immediately. I had not worn a heavy enough coat, and I had known that before I left, and I had decided it was fine. Some discomforts you accept, some you simply walk through. Meridian's 14th floor had a view of the river. Josephine had arranged a quiet start for me. No formal induction queue, no IT orientation day. There was a small office with a glass wall, a desk that faced the window, and a brief, direct conversation with Meridian's managing partner about what we were building and on what timeline. I spent my first morning going through my personal email, which now contained 3 years of client correspondence I had gradually migrated off the Hargrove address. I spent my first afternoon on 2 calls, both with contacts I had already spoken with personally, both of whom had received a note from me the previous week explaining that I had moved firms and that Meridian could offer them something I had designed specifically with their situations in mind. Both of them asked me to send the paperwork. At 4:30 on that first day, my personal cell received a text from one of the junior account coordinators at Hargrove, a woman named Hadley who had been on my team for 3 years. She had my number because I had given it to her during a period when I was worried about her professional well-being and wanted her to have a way to reach me outside official channels. She had used it twice in 3 years, both times in genuine professional emergencies. This was a 3rd time. The message said, "Valentina is trying to reach the Stonereach Fund and Gerald won't pick up. Nobody knows what to do. I'm sorry to contact you on this." I read it twice. Gerald's mobile number was in the Hargrove CRM. What the CRM did not tell Valentina was that Gerald had never responded to calls from numbers he didn't have saved, which meant calls from Hargrove's main switchboard went unanswered as a matter of course. His personal mobile, the number that actually reached him, was in my private notes. The number for his assistant, who could route calls when Gerald was unavailable, was also in my private notes. Valentina had the official number. The official number rang out. I put my phone face down on the desk. There was nothing honest I could have said that would have helped. Day 2. Josephine appeared in my office doorway at 9 with 2 coffees and the expression of someone maintaining careful neutrality in the face of considerable satisfaction. "How bad?" I asked. "The Stonereach situation has developed," she said. She sat down. Gerald's office sent a formal email to Hargrove yesterday afternoon indicating they were initiating a review of their provider relationships. In institutional fund management, initiating a review of provider relationships is the coded phrasing for preparing to leave. It is the professional equivalent of calling for the bill before dessert. Everyone in every room understands what it means. "What else?" I said. "The Caldwell filing," she said. I looked at her steadily. "Valentina called the Blackthorn contact from the handover document," she said. "The name on the sticky note," he explained, politely, thoroughly, that he was no longer the primary contact on that account and directed her to his colleague. She continued, the colleague had confirmed that the process for the quarterly disclosure had been updated 8 months ago, and that the new sequence required a specific internal routing through 3 teams before the external filing could proceed. Neither Valentina nor anyone in the compliance team had been briefed on this update because the only person who had been briefed was the person who had designed the new process, and that person had left the building 36 hours earlier. How long does Hargrove have on the filing window? I said. As of today, 3 days, she said. 3 days was technically sufficient time if someone with full process knowledge acted immediately. No one at Hargrove had full process knowledge. The fragments they had, the partial briefings I had given to individual team members over the months, were sufficient to execute each isolated step, but not to understand how the steps connected or in what sequence they needed to happen. The Stonereach AUM, I said. 280 million, she said. Oh, and others? 2 more have made preliminary noise, smaller, but they're following the signal. We sat with this for a moment. How is Adrian managing all of this? I said. Josephine's expression shifted, barely. He called Graham twice by 10 this morning, she said. I nodded. How are you? She said. I thought about it. Busy, I said. In a good way. Day 2 had a second development I had not specifically orchestrated, but also had not worked to prevent. At 2:15, my personal cell rang with a Hargrove number. I almost did not answer. But I was curious in the specific cold way I get when something is confirming itself on a timeline I had estimated but not controlled exactly. It was Graham. He introduced himself formally as though I might have deleted him, which I had not. As I had kept the contact in the way you keep things that may have future documentary value rather than in the way you keep things you intend to use. He said he hoped the call wasn't awkward, a phrase that signals the person saying it knows it is. And then explained in careful terms that the complexity of certain accounts had presented what he described as transitional learning curve challenges. I wondered, he said, whether you might be available for a brief consulting arrangement, just to provide some continuity on a few specific matters. I heard everything he was not saying. The filing, the client reviews, the realization, arriving too late, that the machine had not been as self-sufficient as they had assumed. Graham, I said, I've taken a position at Meridian. Oh, I started yesterday. The pause that followed had a specific quality, the quality of someone revising a significant assumption in real time. I see, he said. I'm not in a position to consult on Hargrove client matters, I said. I'm happy to provide anything that falls within the scope of the handover documentation, but anything beyond that would create a conflict. Of course, he said. Absolutely. I understand. He said goodbye with the flat, controlled effect of someone managing the expression of a very large problem. I set my phone down and looked at the river. Day 3. I assembled what happened on day 3 from multiple sources over time. The coordinator's texts, which became increasingly terse as the day progressed. A debrief I had 6 months later with Hargrove's former head of compliance, who had left the firm and spoke with the candor of someone with nothing left to protect, Josephine's own information network, and 1 or 2 things that Adrian eventually told me directly in the context of divorce proceedings, when the full shape of those 3 days had become relevant to other conversations. Day 3 began with the Caldwell filing window in its final 24 hours. The internal compliance team had been working the problem for 2 days. They had completed 3 of the 5 routing steps correctly. The 4th step required a specific consultation with an internal risk committee that had never, in anyone's memory, been involved in this process, because I had incorporated it into the sequence quietly 8 months ago without making the consultation visible in any general workflow document. From the outside, the 4th step simply looked like a gap. Nobody had a record of what was supposed to happen there. The risk committee, contacted cold by a compliance officer who could not fully explain why they were being contacted, responded with appropriate institutional caution. They needed to understand the request before approving anything. This was correct behavior. It was also fatal to the timeline. The filing window closed at 5 in the afternoon. The submission that went in was technically complete on its face, but procedurally out of sequence in a way that was not immediately obvious, and would be identified 6 weeks later during a routine audit. At the same time, Gerald from the Stonereach Fund called Graham directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. After it ended, asked Graham's assistant, who had worked with him for 8 years and could read his expressions with accuracy, told the junior coordinator that he had come out of his office looking like someone who had just been handed an invoice they believed someone else had agreed to pay. The Stonereach formal transfer notice arrived the following morning. That same afternoon, Valentina submitted her resignation. The firm accepted it and released a brief internal memo citing mutual agreement and organizational realignment. The memo went out on a Thursday, which is when organizations send news they want people to process over the weekend when they're not in the office. I know this because the coordinator forwarded it to me. I looked at it once, filed it, moved on. What followed the 3 days was not a collapse in the dramatic sense. It was a recalibration that was, if anything, more painful than a collapse because it happened slowly and in full visibility. The Stonereach transfer to Meridian was formalized first. The paperwork was clean. The Hargrove non-solicitation clause had been reviewed by 2 sets of legal counsel and found unenforceable in the specific circumstances. And Gerald had initiated contact with me independently, which rendered the clause moot in any case. The transfer processed in under 2 weeks. The Caldwell endowment followed. The regulatory filing discrepancy had triggered a breach of service level provision in their contract. A provision I had negotiated into that contract 4 years ago, at a point when I had been thinking about what a clean exit clause would look like for a client caught in a firm-level failure. At the time I had framed it to Caldwell as a client protection, which it was. It just turned out to be a protection against the firm itself. Caldwell's investment committee used it. They exited without penalty within 30 days of the audit flag. The Aldermore Group, the family office I had managed for 7 years, transferred without drama or documentation dispute. The principal had called me on day 1, confirmed where I was, and scheduled a meeting for 2 days later. At that meeting, he said 7 words. "We've always been following you, not them." I said I was glad to hear it. 4 more clients followed over the subsequent 6 weeks. 2 completed full transfers, 2 moved significant portions of their mandates while formally remaining with Hargrove, a split that was, commercially speaking, a message. The combined AUM that moved to Meridian in those 8 weeks was just over $1 billion. The consequences for Hargrove were substantial and would continue compounding for the better part of a year. The firm was not in danger of closing. It had a diversified book, institutional reserves, and sufficient mid-tier client relationships to absorb the revenue loss over time. But it was going to have a difficult fiscal year, and the partners were going to have a very specific conversation about accountability and oversight that I was told, secondhand, was unusually direct by the standards of that particular boardroom. Adrian's position at the firm was more precarious than the firm's as a whole. His standing as a senior partner had been substantially predicated on the institutional client revenue that his function was associated with. Revenue that had, in practical terms, been generated by the relationships I managed, the clients I retained, and the function I had built. When that revenue began migrating to another firm, the basis for his seniority became visible as something that had always been constructed on a foundation he had not built. The partners asked questions. The questions did not have good answers. I did not track what happened next in detail. I had enough to do. The divorce was filed 6 weeks after my last day at Hargrove. By Adrian, not by me. He filed first, which I have always found instructive. It told me either that his solicitors had advised moving quickly for strategic reasons, or that he had anticipated I would be less tractable than the version of me he had been managing expectations around. He was right about the second part. He was too late for the first to matter. My solicitor had the property contribution analysis prepared before the filing arrived. The documentation of my capital contributions to the joint investment was systematic, chronological, and clear. The outcome of the property division was, broadly, proportional to what I had put in, which was most of it. My solicitor said once, reviewing the pre-prepared file, "When did you have this put together?" "A while ago," I said. She did not ask when. She was, I think, putting together the timeline herself. The divorce finalized 7 months after filing. Uncontested in the technical sense because the documentation made contestation impractical. My equity stake at Meridian had been structured with near-term liquidity precisely because I had anticipated needing it, and I bought out Adrian's interest in the apartment at a fair market valuation and stayed. I had thought about leaving. The symbolic argument for starting elsewhere was not lost on me. But the apartment was excellent, the location was convenient, and the symbolic argument for staying was equally valid. This was my city. This was my life. It was continuing. I was not moving for the sake of a gesture. I had the spare bedroom repainted, a deep, specific green that changed the room entirely. It cost £400 and 2 evenings of smelling like fresh paint, which turned out to be an oddly settling smell, the smell of surfaces being remade. There is something I want to be precise about. Because this kind of story invites the wrong conclusion if you are not careful. What I did during those 6 weeks of handover was strategic. It was deliberate. I do not intend to soften it into something that sounds like circumstance. I made specific choices about what institutional knowledge to transfer and what to take with me. I made specific choices about which conversations to have with clients and when. I prepared my exit with care and executed it with precision, and the outcome, Valentina's departure, the client transfers, the regulatory discrepancy, the recalibration of Adrian's standing, was the foreseeable result of decisions I had made with clear eyes. I am not going to tell you I felt nothing. I felt the grief of 11 years ending. I felt, specifically, the loss of the version of my marriage I had believed in when I was 31, and sitting across from Adrian at a dinner that had started as a work event and ended with us closing down a restaurant in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. That version of things had been real to me, once, and something that was real does not disappear simply because it stops being true. I gave myself 2 evenings for that. I sat with it without minimizing it. I did not tell myself I had always known. I let it be a loss. And then I went back to work. 4 months after leaving Hargrove, I ran into Valentina at an industry conference. A mid-size event, sponsored by an asset management trade body, held in a hotel with the inevitable carpet and the mid-morning coffee that cost twice what it should. I had been attending a session on operational risk in institutional client management, which had a specific irony I chose not to comment on. She was at the registration desk collecting her badge when I arrived. She saw me at almost the same moment I saw her. She did not look away. I respected that. I collected my own badge and moved toward the refreshments table. She followed. "Celeste," she said. "Valentina," I said. We stood with our coffees in the specific way of 2 professionals who share recent complicated history and have each decided independently not to make it into a scene. "How are you finding Meridian?" she asked. She had done her research. "Very well," I said. "You?" She looked at her coffee. "Finding my footing," she said. We stood quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know. Not the full scope of what the role involved. I didn't know." I considered how to respond. She was right that she hadn't known. Whatever Adrian and Graham had presented to her, whatever version of the role they had offered, it had not included an accurate accounting of what client strategy at Hargrove actually required. She had been handed a map of a city she had never visited and expected to navigate without the language. That was not something I had done to her. It was something done by the people who had offered her the position with more confidence than knowledge. The role was harder than it looked from the outside, I said. "Any role built by someone who's good at it is?" she said. I looked at her. She met my eyes. There was something in her expression that was neither apology nor accusation. Something more like a person who has revised their understanding of a situation and is still in the process of deciding what to do with the revised version. "For what it's worth," I said, "anyone walking into that situation without the accumulated context would have struggled." "But you knew that," she said. "When you handed it over." She said it without heat, just as an observation. I did not confirm or deny. I had nothing to gain from the conversation in either direction, and I felt no particular need to perform either generosity or hardness. The morning session was beginning. People moved toward the room. "Good luck," I said. And I meant it. In the limited way that genuine good luck for a person coexists with having no particular investment in how things go for them. I walked into the session. She did not follow. 9 months after starting at Meridian, I was sitting in my office on the 14th floor when Josephine appeared in the doorway with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone who has decided that a specific moment deserves marking. "What is this?" I said. "This," she said, producing 2 glasses from behind the door frame in a way that suggested the whole thing had been planned to look spontaneous, "is the quarter-end numbers." She set a single page on my desk. I read it. The institutional client function I had been building at Meridian had, in its first 3 full quarters, exceeded its performance targets by 31%. I got the AUM under management in the function was now above the 1 billion mark. Client retention was at 100%. I set the page down. "That's good," I said. "That's more than good," she said. She poured the wine. I accepted my glass and held it. Not drinking, exactly. Holding. "Are you happy?" she said. It was not the question I was expecting. It was also, as it often is with her, the right one. I thought about it honestly. "More than I have been in a long time," I said. "The work?" "Partly," I said, "and partly because I'm not managing in 2 directions anymore." She nodded. She understood what I meant without me filling in the details. The specific exhaustion of performing excellence while simultaneously managing the discomfort that your excellence creates in the people nearest to you. The energy that goes into being capable while also being tolerable to people who find capability threatening. The cost sustained over years of maintaining both at once until you can no longer tell which one is the performance. "You can just be good now," she said. I looked at the river through the window. The light was going, that specific late afternoon color that makes a city look briefly like itself. "Yes," I said. I took a sip of the wine. It was a good wine, room temperature, not cold enough to have been thought about in advance, which meant she had grabbed it impulsively, which meant she had been genuinely pleased, and not just marking a calendar date. That detail, small and specific, was the best part of the moment. A year and 2 months after my last day at Hargrove, my assistant put through a call I had not expected. Graham. He identified himself carefully, as though I might have deleted the contact. I had not. I had kept it, as I said, for potential documentary value. People sometimes say things in unexpected phone calls that are useful to have on record. He began with pleasantries. I allowed them. Then he said the firm was in a period of transition, that they were rebuilding the institutional client function, that they were looking, he said with considerable care, for senior advisors who might be available on a consulting basis, just to provide some perspective on structural approaches to the institutional segment. He did not say, "We dismantled something we didn't understand, and we're now paying the cost of the dismantling." He didn't need to. The meaning was perfectly audible in the space around the words he chose. I let him finish. "Graham," I said, "I appreciate the call. I'm not available for consulting engagements with former employers. I hope you understand that." "Of course," he said immediately. "Absolutely." "How is the firm doing?" I said. Genuinely, not as a blade. "We're working through some things," he said. "Good luck with it," I said. I ended the call. My assistant appeared in the doorway 15 seconds later to confirm that the 4 o'clock was ready. "I'll be right there," I said. I straightened my papers, capped my pen, stood up. At the end of the hall, 4 people from a mid-sized pension fund were waiting in the conference room, clients who had been referred to Meridian specifically by Gerald from Stonereach, who had given them my name and said, in the way that Gerald communicated when he meant something, simply, "Call her." I walked down the hall. At least the conference room smelled like fresh coffee. The good kind, the kind someone had thought to make. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table. "Good morning," I said. "Let's get started."